My name is Daniel Lemanowski. I'm the president of IASG. If you are here for IASG, you're in the right place. We meet every Tuesday at this time in this room, unless said otherwise. Make sure you guys join our Slack if you haven't. I believe it's iasg.slack.com, and sign up for the mailing list if you are not on that and want to receive information on what's going on in the next week's meeting. So we'll just do a quick cabinet introduction, and then we've got RSM here to do an overview on pen testing. So like I said, I'm Daniel, and I'm the president.
I'm Cole Sweets, I'm the secretary.
I'm Logan Woolery, I'm the treasurer.
Keane, I'm the public relations chair.
Megan Miller, I'm the secretary.
I'm Kevin Davis, I'm the social chair.
And then Vice President Logan is not here at this moment, I don't think. So I'll have to say hi some other time. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over.
Sweet. Thanks, guys. Well, first off, thanks for having us out here for the first meeting of the year. Always great to be able to come out and see the folks. So yeah, we are going to be doing a overview of pen testing. Starting off, who are we? Who am I? Who is Sean? Who is RSM? What do we do? Doing a pretty brief overview of just kind of what is pen testing like? Just at a high level, what is it for? What do you do? And then a little bit about the job. What can you expect as a pen tester? Both Sean and I are professional red teamers, and so we can give you a little bit of insight into what we do on a daily basis. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking through methodology. Really talking through the steps that we take, some of the attack vectors that we utilize in real world engagements, how we compromise real networks, real environments, real clients, what works, what doesn't work, some of the stuff that we found works better than others. And then at the end, we'll give you guys some resources, if you're interested in the stuff, some cool sites that have VMs and stuff you can download and go from there. There we go. So who are we? So to start off with, who is RSM? So RSM is the 5th largest tax audit and consulting firm. We, of course, are with the tax group. We're with the consulting group. But so we focus on mid-market, so medium-sized businesses, rather than like the Fortune 500s and stuff like that. We are based all throughout the U.S., so we have a bunch in the Midwest and stuff. I'm out of the Des Moines location. But we're West Coast, East Coast, as well as kind of worldwide as well. So we've got stuff all over Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, whatever. So we're kind of all over the board there. And then about me. So I'm Dave Casa at Golden Gun Sec on Twitter. I'm a supervisor with our security, privacy, and risk consulting group at RSM. I graduated from here, Iowa State, and I am a former IASG member myself, actually. I have my OSCP and then located in Des Moines, like I said, and somehow I've found out how to make auditing a fun job. I do a lot of pen testing, social engineering, breaking into buildings, stuff like that, and then incident response and remediation, where you're kind of coming in and cleaning up after the fact, after a bad guy gets into a network.
My name is Sean Jones. I'm also supervisor at RSM. I do the same thing that Dave does. I have a few certs. I've been doing IT and IT security for about 12 years professionally. So we spend a lot of our time doing like the red team stuff, so offensive security, but we also help clients secure stuff as far as when we find gaps, and then as far as incident response and things like that as well.
So, disclaimer, the obligatory disclaimer goes without saying. We're going to be covering, like we said, a lot of tools, techniques, attack vectors that we use in real world scenarios. Please don't do anything stupid with this information. Please only use this on environments that you own or you have explicit written permission to test against. So, thank you. So yeah, into the overview of pen testing. So what is pen testing, right? Buzzwords get thrown around all the time. So you hear a lot about like pen testing or red teaming or penetration testing or whatever. A lot of people don't really know what goes into it or what it means. So really at its core, it is testing a network or application to find vulnerabilities and misconfigurations and then assess those for their potential impact. So really looking and seeing, hey, what is the risk here? What's the gap here? How could this potentially be abused? And this does require you to think like an attacker. So you have to say, how can I take this legitimate functionality that has an intended purpose and then misuse or abuse that in an unintended way to gain access or gain information that I should not have access to? And really at the end of the day, the goals are to assess risk, to determine control gaps, and then to recommend process and product improvements. And again, so this is going to really follow, we try and follow the way an attacker works, or the methodology of an attacker, as closely as possible. We want to give as close to a possible approximation as we can to our client. So we're going to start with reconnaissance, going through selecting targets, doing research, background research, establishing our initial beachhead, getting a shell in a box, going, once we have that initial shell, expanding, moving laterally in the network, targeting the enterprise level, trying to get DA, trying to move into separate domains that are in the same enterprise, persisting in all those environments, so establishing as much persistence as we can to ensure that if one of our shells gets cut, we still have access into the environment. And then finally, exfiltration and maintenance. So exfiltration of data, once you have that data, what are you doing with it? About the job. So it is typically a consulting-based profession, or consulting-based engagements. There are some internal red team type positions. Those are usually going to be more at your Fortune 500, where they're big enough to have their own full-time internal red team, and those are usually fairly small. There are a lot of different areas that you can specialize in. It's very hard to be great at everything. You have internal testing, external testing, web app testing, mobile testing, physical testing, and then you have red team assessments, which really kind of encompasses all of those things. So really, you can specialize in any of these. People have devoted years and years and years to becoming the best in any one of these fields, or a specific facet of one of those fields. So security, as you all know, is a very broad field. So engagement range, anywhere from a week to 3 months plus. So, your typical pen test engagement, going to be a week to 2 weeks, maybe some on-site, some off-site, some wrap-up with the client, and then getting into your red team assessment, where you're really kind of emulating an attack, or you're going through that whole attacker methodology. Those can get into your 2, 3, 4, 5 month range, where you're taking your time, you're trying to avoid detection, you're trying to go slow, stay under the radar. And then varying amounts of travel based on your engagement profile. So I know a lot of people hear consulting, they say, oh great, I'm going to be on the road 100% of the time. That's not necessarily the case. Based on your engagement load, if you're on a lot of external engagements, if you're a lot on remote testing, web app testing, mobile testing, really no travel involved in those. Whereas if you're doing physical testing, internal testing, that type of stuff, yeah, there might be a bit more travel. And then finally, communication is an often overlooked skill. So one of the biggest skills that a lot of people don't focus on is the ability to take a very technical finding, something that we're able to understand as security professionals, but not be able to break that down to something that a CEO or a CFO or somebody who maybe doesn't have as technical of a background could understand. And that's a huge skill, and part of what makes a consultant a great consultant. So, like I said, majority of our time, we're going to be delving into kind of the more technical aspects of an attack. So we're going to be going through our methodology now, starting with, if we get a client, if we get a target, what are we going to do to try and see what we can find out about them? So we'll start with footprinting and enumeration. Usually we're going to start with discussions with the client to help develop a threat model that matches their profile. So we're going to sit down and talk to that client. We're going to say, hey, what are your pain points? What is your sensitive data? What do you guys care about? And then we'll move into passive and active methods used to gather open source intelligence. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. And then really all these methods, we're going to start before we send a single packet to them, right? We're not just going to first day fire up Nmap and just see what we can see. We're going to do a lot of background research. We find over and over again that this background research that you do is so much more valuable than just tossing a port scanner at a publicly facing IP address. So threat modeling. So there are a bunch of different attacks, right? Different attack vectors, different, whatever, based on what services they're running, especially if it's a larger organization that has a very large publicly facing footprint. There's almost a limitless number of things that you could try. You could spend months just trying to get your foot in the door. So really what we do is we sit down and we say, again, sit with the client, what are the impacts that can damage you? What is your sensitive data? Where is that stored? How is it accessed? Who has access to it? And then from there, we can kind of work backwards to build out what attack would make the most sense based on that data. And then, so what's a bad thing that could happen and what controls can stop it from happening? We then design tests to attempt to break those controls. Moving into the passive stuff. So after we sit down with the client, we have that initial discussion, going through and doing the threat modeling. We start with some passive reconnaissance. So Google dorking, Google hacking, trying to figure out what they have that's publicly available. And you can actually toss in some kind of interesting queries into Google and get back some very interesting results. So Google is really good at what it does. It's spidering the web and pulling anything that it sees, basically. So we got a screenshot here that just shows if you put in a certain string, you can actually search for publicly available IP cameras. So these are IP cameras that, for whatever reason, they were incorrectly configured and they're available on the public internet, and you can actually Google them. So that's always fun, because more often than not, things that are publicly available via Google, they didn't know enough to secure them somehow. They probably have default creds, they probably have this, they have that. That's often a great starting point if you can get into a network that way. The next big one's harvesting information from social media. So that's going to be names, emails, phone numbers. That's great stuff that you can use in a phishing attack later to try and get an initial shell off a box. And then doing whois, lookups, DNS recon, trying to enumerate domains and subdomains. So oftentimes you're going to have your top-level corporate domain and a bunch of random subdomains. Various states of maintenance are usually in those subdomains. Sometimes they have their top-level corporate domain. It's maintained on a regular basis, usually pretty well secured. They might have a subdomain sticking off there that they've kind of just forgotten about. Might either have some good intel on it, or might even have a vulnerability or something that you can potentially exploit. And then once we get done with all that, we move into more of our active enumeration. So that's going to be Nmap, unicorn scan, that type of stuff. Now, before I get too much further on the technical side of stuff, show of hands, who all has experience with pen testing, either professionally or cool? How about grad school program? How many information assurance grad school folks? Just a few, a lot of undergrads. Cool, starting young, I like it. So anyhow, once we get all that, once we build up our profile of that client, once we go through and we kind of have our list of, hey, here's the IP, here's the host names, here are some users, here's some information, we start with our initial compromise. So getting the first foothold on the network can often be the most difficult part of an attack. Attacks against web-facing surfaces, that's going to be the publicly available services, right? Their web server, their email server, their VPN server, stuff like that. They sometimes work. Don't get me wrong, there have been some very big name breaches that have occurred as a result of attacks on publicly facing services. SQL injection attacks, stuff like that do sometimes still work. However, there's stuff that's out there scanning the internet 24/7, and it's not the good guys, it's the bad guys that are out there looking for these vulnerabilities. So very often these vulnerabilities have either been caught by the corporation's internal blue team. They've detected these vulnerabilities already with a vulnerability scanner or something like that, or unfortunately a bad guy might have detected these and they've learned their lessons from that. We've found typically on our red team engagements that social engineering is usually the best way to get into a network. And that's just due to the fact that it's a whole heck of a lot easier to ask somebody for their password than to try and steal it. You can just send them an attachment and an email, and more often than not, they seem to open it. And yeah, you don't need to break down the door if you can get someone to open it for you, so you don't have to try and bypass firewalls or this or that, or try and break security controls on an application when somebody just will click an executable that you send them and give you a shellback. So some phishing stats real quick. So these are from 2016, so it's a little bit old, but still pretty recent. 23% of users click on phishing emails, and then 11% of users actually open attachments in phishing emails. So if you send out 9, you figure you'll get a shellback, which pretty accurate, and you can actually boost that pretty effectively via targeted phishing. So based on the time of year, based on whose information you're able to grab, one that works really great is during the holiday times. You can send out an email pretending to be from HR, say something along the lines of, due to recent federal regulation changes, we've had to modify your PTO during the holidays. And it's an Excel sheet, and everybody, they just think, oh crap, I'm not going to be able to take Christmas off, go on holiday or whatever. So you get a pretty good click-through rate on those. So, initial compromise. What do we have to bypass when attempting to do an initial compromise, again, via a social engineering attack, from an external perspective? So we have your inline and perimeter controls. So that's going to be your stuff that's between the end user and you. So think firewall, IDS, any sort of network monitoring. I already, okay, there we go. Firewall and IPS. Palo Alto, Fortinet, Cisco Firepower, these are just some examples of some of the next gen or current gen products that we see at a lot of clients. Spam filters. So this is a big one, and in the past 2-3 years it's actually become a much bigger thorn in our side. It used to be very trivial to bypass those because much like AV, they were just looking for signatures, kind of those known bad signatures. Recently they've gotten a lot smarter, so this has become a bit of a bigger problem to bypass. Web filters, and then why do we care about these? So these controls have advanced along with attackers' methods. So again, back in the day, 2-3 years ago, and before that, they were just doing some very basic, hey, is this coming from a blacklisted domain? Is it coming from Russia or some weird place? Is it have some sort of matching signature to known malware? No? All right, let's go ahead and send it through. Well, nowadays, they're doing stuff like sandboxing. So that means they're going to run the attachment in a sandbox in the actual appliance and see if anything bad happens, see if a process starts, see if it tries to make any calls out to a publicly facing IP address, that type of stuff. They're using machine learning algorithms to detect obfuscation in confidential data. So this is both on the inbound and outbound side. So attackers, aren't dumb. They know that if they send their stuff or include stuff in plain text, it's a whole heck of a lot easier for a defender to intercept that, right? They can look for certain patterns, right? Keywords. So what attackers have done, they've started obfuscating data, and within, I don't know, past 3 or 4 years, really everything has been over an obfuscated channel. C2 communications, typically all obfuscated or over an encrypted channel. Payloads themselves, all obfuscated nowadays. What defenders are doing now is they're catching up. There's some very cool tools out there. Revoke obfuscation is a great one. Basically, they're actually able to detect if something is obfuscated due to the way that it's, that maybe the occurrence of certain characters that would not occur typically, capitalization, stuff like that, just things you wouldn't see in a normal payload, and they're actually able to block based simply on something being obfuscated. They're doing real-time heuristic analysis, and then they're also doing inbound and outbound traffic inbound and outbound traffic inspection. So it used to be, you got a shell in. Really, it's kind of an open door on the way out. Companies would pretty well allow any traffic outbound from their internal network. Nowadays, there's a lot more restrictive rules in place where they're doing not only blocking of certain ports, they're doing a lot of inspection of that actual traffic, which makes it much more difficult to get something out the door, get that C2 back, get that communication, that command and control back, without them detecting it. So what's the next set of controls we have to compromise, or bypass, I should say. So that's the endpoint controls. So what does that entail? That entails your AV or your HIPS, so that's your host-based intrusion prevention. So that's going to be your Cylance, your FireAmp, any of your next-gen AV controls. That's going to be your whitelistings. That's going to be Carbon Black, App Locker, any of those. Whitelisting, really what that is, that says, hey, you can only run certain approved programs. So if I try and bring over my own binary, malicious.exe, and have somebody double click on that, that's not going to work due to whitelisting. It says, hey, you can only run these certain predefined approved Microsoft applications. For a normal user, that doesn't really matter, but it does make our job a whole heck of a lot harder, and it requires us to really live off the land, right? It requires us to use the binaries, the tools, the files that are already on the box to get a shell back, which kind of limits us to an extent. And then why do we care about these controls? So again, they've advanced in the past few years. So it used to be, AV was file level only, right? It would look at files, it would look and see what's on the disk, and that was about it. That led to attackers moving to a lot of memory-based attacks within the past. I would say with the release of Empire back in 2015 is around the time it started going on. But I mean, so you can do C2 straight from memory, never have a file actually touch disk. However, these next-gen AV products, Silence, FireAmp, etc., they're actually able to look in memory and see malicious execution, malicious processes in memory and stop that execution. So that makes, again, our jobs more difficult. Relational process monitoring is another thing that these next-gen tools are doing. So what that means is basically a lot of times when you're starting a process and you're getting your initial shell back, you're not doing it in the normal way. So you think when a user, they do something that, let's say they open PowerShell.exe on their computer. They're going to go to the start button, they're going to go start, go find PowerShell.exe and click on it. What that means is that PowerShell.exe is a child process of Explorer.exe. Now when I run it from a macro or some other process, it's not, which makes it very easy to pick up and say, hey, this is not looking right. And then finally, blocking and alerting on the most commonly utilized methods. So again, in the past 2 years, PowerShell has kind of become the de facto attacker toolkit. I would say every attacker is doing stuff out of PowerShell now. And they're actually starting to move away from it now because defense is getting so good at picking up attacks that are occurring via PowerShell. So, how do we bypass those controls? We talked a lot about a bunch of controls that are in place, how difficult it is now. So, first things first, do not use default payloads or configs. This is VirusTotal. This is a default payload that I just did a straight copy paste from PowerShell Umpire, which is a post-exploitation agent entirely in PowerShell. It's pretty cool, it's free. But anyways, default macro payload, toss that in an Excel file, threw it on VirusTotal, 29 out of 58. I mean, 29 out of 58 doesn't sound horrible, you know, it's what, 50%. However, this is going to be all your big ones, right? This is going to be your McAfee, your Symantec, your Trend Micro, your Avast. Anything you'd really see in use is going to be picking that up. However, we can start doing some real small tweaks to make a pretty big difference. So taking a look at the actual macro. So this is a little snippet of the actual macro code that's going to be in that Excel doc. So we see that we have a function call here. We have the sub auto open, and then it calls that function, and it calls PowerShell, and then we have a big block of base64 encoded text. Now, base64 encoded text, especially PowerShell text, is fun because PowerShell is case insensitive. So you can capitalize stuff, you can lowercase stuff, however you want. PowerShell does not care. What that means is when you capitalize and lowercase stuff and then you base64 encode it, you can get a completely unique fingerprint on your base64 encoded text every time you rerun something. So it's very hard to fingerprint that. However, what AV can flag on is a few certain things, right? We have this function call, we have auto open, we have a straight call to PowerShell, that's pretty easy to pick up on. So how easy is it to bypass? So again, what we're going to do is we're just going to change auto open to auto close. So now the macro, instead of running as soon as Excel opens, runs as soon as Excel closes. And then we're going to change PowerShell to pow plus Rshell. So, you know, this took about 15 seconds. And we are now down to 18 in 2 words. So, I mean, with a bit more tweaking, we get to 1. So it's pretty easy once you start modifying text. I mean, a lot of AV still isn't that great at picking stuff up. You just can't use your default payloads. So now the next problem, relational process analysis. So we did already talk a little bit about that. So that is when someone executes our macro, the parent process is not Explorer.exe. So when I go, like I said, run PowerShell, it's going to be a child of Explorer.exe, as we can see here on the left. Now, if I run it from a macro or some other process, we have it as a child of, you know, services.exe, svchost.exe, you know, it really goes down pretty far. That's very easy to pick up by a next-gen AV product. So how do we get around that? So, Excel macros use VBA, which allows for direct shellcode injection into the memory, or into the process space memory via the macro. So you don't actually have to start a new process at all. You can get a shell back and not create any new processes. You can also utilize a 2-stage attack, where your initial attack doesn't actually start a new process. All your initial attack does is it goes and it backdoors a bunch of stuff, and then the next time the user performs a normal action, it will then kick it off, but make it look like it's a user-started process. So we do have a real quick demo. I don't know how this is going to work with the 2 screens. We'll give it a go. All right, so what we have here is this is, again, just a macro, malicious macro that's going to do some direct shellcode injection into memory. You can see we're doing some virtual allocations, some memory allocations, and then we should get a shellback off this if everything goes according to plan. Go ahead and minimize this. And then we also have Process Explorer up, so let's go ahead. We'll go find our excel.exe process. And we see that right now we have 114 processes running. We'll go ahead and run this macro quick. Oops, too many things open. There we go. So, looks like we got an interpreter shell. Great, no child processes for excel.exe, and we're still sitting at 114. So with shellcode injection, we are, as you see, able to actually get a shell back without starting any new processes, which is pretty cool. However, now to show you the other side of the coin and why I said, you know, never use a default payload, we're going to go ahead and we're going to save this off real quick. Toss this on the desktop. We'll just call it shellcode macro. No. .xls. There we go. Save that. And then we'll give this, I don't know, maybe 15 seconds. And we should be getting a nice little pop-up. Hey, there we go. Shellcode macro, that's a bad thing. So as an attacker, that's never something that we want to see. AV picking it up immediately. But again, this is another example of why you never use default stuff. So the macro that I used, that shellcode macro that we were demoing, came directly from Metasploit. So that's just another example of, you know, why you don't use your default options. Getting back into this. Okay, so a whole lot of these attacks do seem to be leveraging PowerShell.exe. I know I've been droning on about it all night. So what if PowerShell is blocked by something like AppLocker, Carbon Black, you know, just you can't run PowerShell as a normal user? What happens then? Well, so luckily there are quite a few workarounds that leverage other files in Windows that are not always blocked that we can execute our code from. So if you are interested in this, in these AppLocker bypasses, step one, follow this guy, SubT, @SubT on Twitter. He's an absolute genius. Always has good stuff. But that's step one there. Step two, we've got a bunch of other binaries that are on Windows that actually do allow you to run code. regserve32 is a great one. rundll32 is fun. It actually allows you to pull uncompiled C# code into memory and then compile it in memory, so you can basically be running a binary but never have to drop a binary on disk. When I say binary, I just mean like a .exe or an executable file. So it allows you to pull, execute a binary in memory, never have anything touch disk. msbuild.exe and then nps.exe is a cool one. However, since that is not a Microsoft app, nps.exe is basically just a front end for PowerShell. Really all that PowerShell.exe is a fancy little user interface or front end for the system.automation DLL. Any executable that you build has access to that DLL. You can build it so it has access to that DLL. So really, and all that NPS is doing, or any other sort of custom C# binary that you can write yourself in Visual Studio is doing, is just giving you a front-end user interface to interact with the DLL on the disk. So it's useful more so if PowerShell.exe is blacklisted versus if there's a whitelisting application, because again, this is going to be a custom binary that you're dropping onto disk. It's not Microsoft signed. So if they are doing a true whitelisting with like AppLocker or Carbon Black, it won't work. Okay, so let's say on top of all of this, they don't allow any macros at all. So, you know, again, most of these attacks we've talked through so far have leveraged some sort of macro. And people are getting smarter and smarter when it comes to macros. Like, hey, there's a weird warning, I'm not going to enable macros, let's not do that. Why not just attack Excel directly? So Excel is fun because it's actually an interpreter. Have any of you guys ever done like equals and then 1 + 3 or something like that in a field and hit enter and, you know, something happens, says 4. If you put equals and nothing after, it gives you an error saying, hey, this is invalid. That's interpreting a function. So really you can take that one step further and you can actually execute code and start processes directly from a cell in Excel. So, CSV injection, it's great. If you allow text and files in at the perimeter, you are vulnerable to this. So, another demo here, real quick. Basically, with this line of text right here, we can actually get a shell. Now, this is just a demo, so rather than doing a whole weaponized deal, I just did poppingcalc.exe. But all that we have to do, and we can actually go and do this in Notepad. So we're going to save this in Notepad. Again, just a line of text. We'll save it as a CSV file, so that's just a comma-separated value file. So we'll just do test CSV, toss that on the desktop. All right. So now we have our CSV file opening in Excel. So remote data is not accessible. To access this data, Excel needs to start another application. Some legitimate applications on your computer could be used maliciously to spread viruses. Okay, whatever. And then says, click yes if you trust the source of this workbook and you want to let the workbook start the application msexcel.exe. Well, that sounds right. Sure, why not? And there we go. We have code execution. So from there, basically with nothing more than a line of text that we can type into Notepad and save as a CSV file, we are able to compromise an organization and get past all their defenses that they have. And then the best part about this is since it's just a line of text, no detections. So with a fully weaponized CSV file, you get past everything. So that is really kind of how we establish our first foothold on the network, how we get in the door, how we get our first shell. Once we're in, Sean's going to talk about how we start moving around and expanding our influence. There you go. Right there for you. Good luck. Yeah.
All right. Oh, that's backwards. There we go. All right. So, yeah, I'm basically going to walk through kind of what we do on a pen test as far as when we, we're just going to assume that we got our first compromise. Someone did click yes. In our experience, someone always clicks yes. So basically, what are we going to do? So basically, we kind of recycle this methodology. So we're going back to recon. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll do that recon. We want to think about persistence because obviously if we got a shell into the environment, we want to keep that shell into the environment or somehow have a way to keep getting back in when someone clicks. I put privilege escalation as far as like a question mark because sometimes you don't have to do that. I mean, if you're at an environment where everybody has admin rights, I don't really have to worry about it. But then if you get a standard user, you might have to do some privilege escalation to do certain types of attacks. And then we're going to pivot because basically, essentially from any sort of pen test, the goal is you're always going to be moving. If we talk about things like the Equifax, things like that, hacking doesn't work that you just compromise a web server and there happens to be like an Excel document that says everybody's SSNs. It doesn't work like that. You have to get within the network. You have to figure out people's credentials. You have to pivot through. You have to figure out the systems. So there's a lot of work that goes into that kind of stuff. So back to recon. So some of the things that you're going to do, these are some commands. You're going to look at like, who am I? You can just run that on Windows. That's going to tell you who you are as the user, try to figure out who I am. We're going to look at what are my rights. So am I a standard user? When I say like privileged user, am I administrator? So you can basically do little commands. Some of you guys might know these, like net local group administrators. This will kind of tell you who's part of the administrators group. Am I part of that? Where can I go? So when you're part of like an Active Directory, basically network, which is like a Windows environment, you can do things like net user. You put your user name that you have and /domain, and you can look for what is my user account, what groups are they part of, and they give you more information. So if you see something like I'm part of domain admins, or I'm, that's a huge win, or even things like Exchange administrator or different things, or SQL admin, things like that, that would be of use. You kind of want to basically do recon and figure those kind of things out. And as far as like who has privileged accounts, you can look for like local groups, do domain admins, or you can look for like enterprise admins, things like this. This is kind of tell you through using just even a standard user account, who are the users that are part of these groups, because that's who we want to target. So the big thing about persistence, obviously I just said it's a huge thing, we want to keep our shell. I just put a few other things that you can do. I mean, there's things that you can do as far as registry, we can modify services, we can do scheduled tasks, so when those kick off, they run our shell again, or basically run our malicious code. Boom, we get a shell back. And you can even backdoor like legitimate applications, doing like backdoor factory and things like that. So, I want to talk about, man, what happens if I'm not an administrator? So there's some things that we can do. So this is basically like your privilege escalation. So we're going to look for things like missing patches, to see if we can take advantage of those. Insecure services, so insecure permissions, so insecure like file permissions. Things like unquoted services, as far as like those are just ways for an attacker to, if like basically a certain service account, if inside the actual directory they don't put quotes inside, you can basically, if there's a space within like the folder, so if it's like C, program files, sillyservice.com or what .exe, basically if there's any sort of unquoted, you can actually fit your own exe in between that space and it will just automatically run that. So you can basically pop off code that way. Misconfigured service rights, so this is again taking advantage of the actual service itself and modifying it to basically do things that you want it to do. You can look for stored plain text passwords. So this is like, believe it or not, in many environments you find tons of people who store their passwords in Word documents, Excel documents, things like that. So there's a big reason to look for those things. And then obviously some of the best things is lateral movement. So sometimes you'll find out that you'll have a user account, and on that certain system, you may not be an admin, but then if you actually scan the network, you'll find out that they have admin to like 50 other machines. So we can take advantage of that as well. So one of I call this a game changer. It's called Bloodhound. So this actually came out about a year ago, and they recently at DerbyCon released a basically C# version of that. The original one was written in PowerShell. But this actually makes it super easy for an attacker, but also Blue Team can use this as well to kind of figure out misconfigurations throughout their network. So some of the pros, it basically can gather tons of information from Active Directory and put that into a graph. So you can actually see. It looks at things like 80 computers, users, groups. We have like who has admin rights and where are they actually currently logged in at, and then it can quickly show you basically like shortest path to full compromise of Active Directory. The only con is if you're doing a large network. So sometimes, I know Dave said we focus middle market. We do Fortune 500 every once in a while. I was just at one about a month ago where they had about 55,000 endpoints, and it was, you couldn't even read anything on the map. So you basically have to learn to kind of do custom queries if you want to get useful information out of it. But this is kind of what it looks like. So it kind of will show you like who has admin to what machine, and you can basically just see how you can kind of pivot throughout the network, or who you have to compromise or what machine you want to compromise to basically dump creds, get those user accounts all the way up to like domain admin to like compromise the network. So once you've done that, one of the big things that we want to do is pivot. We have to go somewhere. So how do we pivot? Remote code execution, so we call those RCE. So those are things like the missing patches. So I don't know if you guys heard about like the shadow brokers. One of the big things that came out of there was this MS17010. So it's called Eternal Blue, which is basically like a buffer overflow, which basically gives you see a client with something like that or a machine on that, it's automatic, pretty much game over. You can pop a system shell on that box, allow you to continually pivot through the network. Gather cracked network hashes, or we can actually relay those. So using like basically even protocols, how Microsoft works, so LLMNR, so link local multicast name resolution. You can do things like Kerberoasting, and even things like when we talk about like SMB signing, and I won't go into huge detail on these things, but you can actually even capture these hashes and just relay them to a certain system, allowing you to execute code without even having to crack that person's password. But most of the time, what we're looking for is some sort of privileged account. So we basically are like looking to dump creds, crack creds, or get some sort of like username and password. And we want that person to be an admin. Hopefully, we're looking for something like a domain admin, but we're looking either for a domain or local administrator account, or we're looking for a user account that just happens to be misconfigured or added to the admin account, which you'll see a lot of times people do, or like a service account. So a lot of times service accounts, they run with higher privileges because they're usually running something with some sort of application. So those are another big things. So kind of the why, some of the stuff, besides just like running code, but even things like RDP or remote desktop, you have to be an administrator, unless you actually specifically put a certain user in there to be allowed to RDP to a machine, or like WMI, which can be used to like execute code remotely and things like that. And there's like, a few other ones that, going back, I think, no, oh yeah, all right, didn't go back. So, some of the things you can do, obviously, when you get administrative access, some of those tasks I talked about before, like the registry, different things like that. So there's some things you can do as a standard user, there's some things you can't. So sometimes you need administrative access to maybe establish, a better persistence. We talked about get NT authority systems, so some of you guys don't know that. So like you have basically an admin account and you have NT authority system. So NT authority system is kind of like a system account that can do a few more things than an administrator account can do. So this can be important for like getting stuff into like the LSAS service and stuff where we're going to try to dump credentials. We can look to like dump clear text passwords. We're also looking to dump like hash passwords. So that's kind of like anybody who knows anything, the hash password is basically like your password encrypted. All right, so what we're really looking to in most like Windows environment, I call it the hunt is on. We're looking for that domain administrator account just because that helps us to pivot more easily around the network. Now, normally, sometimes you get lucky if they reuse local admin account, that's as good as a domain admin account. But also, the thing about AD is that domain administrators by default have basically admin rights to every single system that's part of the domain inside of the Active Directory. We're also looking for, they have rights to other applications. A lot of times people will just configure domain admin to have rights to their SQL databases, other important applications, so you basically can get into anything you want. They have the ability to grant rights, so sometimes even if they like remove rights, so like HR folder, they don't want the IT guys to start looking at people's payroll, but you can just right click and give yourself permission to that and then go look and get that information. And as well, the best part is that they have access to the domain controllers, which is what we really want to get to. So why do we want to get the domain controllers? Well, every user authenticates against the DC, so they kind of hold everybody's basically encrypted passwords because they have to check against that. They also control things like group policies, so that pushes out security policies to your systems. They control the trust, so sometimes companies have multiple domains. And they do multiple other things. And the attacks that we're kind of looking at stuff like that is we're looking to dump hashes, clear text passwords. So we really want to get everybody's passwords off the network because this allows us to get into basically anything we want. So sometimes if they do not allow things like domain admin to get into SQL, we might be able to dump all those service accounts that do have access to SQL and then basically crack those passwords, get into those databases. We also can do things like silver ticket, golden ticket attacks. Basically, a golden ticket attack is a great attack where you can basically grant yourself admin rights to the network for like 10 years. You have skeleton key attacks, which basically gives you you can give yourself basically another password to a user account. The other password's still used, but this is like kind of a backdoor account. Domain trust. So I just want to talk about this. Sometimes in larger environments, there's multiple trusts, and basically trusts can go one way or both way. They can be used to basically scope out certain environments. So like if they have, we'll call it like a PCI, so they have like a credit card environment and they want people that are in this environment to be able to access resources in another domain, but obviously we don't want people to get into this domain. Or a lot of companies will work with other companies, or like there will be a holding company that owns multiple companies. So there's a lot of ways that you can have domain trust, but this can kind of expand your penetration test depending on the scope of can you use one system or basically one domain to access another company's domain. And basically, okay, sensitive data. All right, So most importantly, the most important thing about a pen test is it's not about hacking them. It's not about getting domain admin. It's not about you know, going into them and dropping the mic, being like, dude, I totally pwned your network. It's all about getting data, like what is valuable to the customer. So basically, you know, when we talk to clients, we want to figure out what is important to you. You know, is it credit cards? Is it social security numbers? Is it medical information? You know, do you have like some secret formula that you don't want people to know? What is it? So that's the kind of stuff that we're looking at. So based on the scope of the environment, that's what we kind of find. But if we don't find this kind of stuff, so if we don't find SSNs, they want us to do that, it's kind of like, it's not a successful pen test. Even if we did get domain admin, you really don't show data, like value unless you get that kind of data and present that to the clients. So data collection, so where do we find this data? I mean, we're looking at databases, you know, .back files, that's a really good one, because sometimes they'll just throw those on the network. They're not encrypted. You can just load those up into Studio Manager and fire it up, and then all of a sudden you have the DB that you can get into. You have integrated access into SQL, misconfigured file shares, so that's a big one. So basically, you know, people don't secure their file shares. You can use standard users to find all kinds of information just on their file servers. And OneNote, like notebooks, Word documents, Excel, things like that. You'll find passwords, information, social security numbers. I can't tell you how many times I've found like an entire bank's customers' credit cards or debit cards, or, you know, we find all kinds of things just in Excel documents.
One time I found a notepad doc that had all their online banking customers' passwords for online banking. I was kind of surprised why they had that, but that was neat.
You know, and you end up finding like a lot of stuff. So I mean, we found database files, you know, with like 100,000 records, like SSN records and stuff. But then some of this stuff, you know, I mean, we'll find anything from, you know, we just did a big medical client where we found a database full of everything, like what they got seen for, not just their social security number, but what procedures they had, things like that. And just
forever.
Yeah, going back.
They even were kind enough to digitize all their old records. So not only could I see what somebody came in for last week, but in 1992 I could see what you came in for as well.
So these are the kind of things that we're kind of looking for. We're showing stuff.
Before we go on.
Yeah, I want to do. Yeah, I want to do a demo. I kind of skipped over that. So we're kind of going to show a couple demos of kind of stuff that we do with the tag. I guess I should have been like you and put a demo so I knew when to stop.
Oh yeah, no worries, man.
As I just,
You're on a roll.
I was. Grab the hash.
Yeah.
So this one's just a short, like, minute demo, kind of going over. This is basically like a tool that we use, you know, quite a bit. It's becoming harder as environments kind of lock this down. It's called Responder, but not to go into too much details, but this will gather things like, basically takes advantage of the LLMNR protocol, where you can basically intercept hashes off the network, where you can basically use those to crack and get people's passwords.
So I'm sure a lot of you guys don't know what LLMNR is. Basically, it's fallback to DNS. So if you're on a network that either doesn't have a DNS server is taking too long to reply, or the DNS server doesn't know what resource you're asking for. So let's say, for example, you fat thing or something, instead of typing in share F, you type in share D or something like that. It's going to fall back to LLMNR, and subsequently after that, its predecessor, NDNS, or NetBIOS Name Service. So from there, that traffic is actually sent out in a broadcast to everybody on the network. So you ask the DNS server, you say, hey, does anybody know what Sean PC is? Or I'm sorry, you ask the DNS server, hey, do you know what Sean PC is? And if the DNS server, says no or doesn't get back to me in enough time, I'm then going to say, hey, does anybody know what Sean PC is or what IP address is tied to that? Me being a bad guy in the network, I say, oh yeah, absolutely, it's my IP address. And I'm like, okay, cool, thanks. I don't actually have any sort of authentication mechanism there. I just kind of trust whoever tells me that they're telling the truth. So that's how we can poison responses, because all of a sudden that computer thinks that I'm Sean PC. And that's what we'll be seeing here.
Once we prove that that's right.
In this, I'm looking for payroll, I think, and
Just going to type in a share.
Go ahead and tell them. Yeah.
I gotta watch it too. I'm watching the same thing. He is typing in a share.
I'm looking for a share.
He's looking for a share.
And
He's going to hit enter. There we go. All right, and then we start seeing these hashes come across. So this is basically where a responder picks that up, quickly says, hey, that's me, authenticate towards me, send me your credentials, and then basically we can use these, gather these, we're gonna throw them in the next part into Hashcat, which is another tool used to, it's my favorite tool for cracking passwords. You probably heard of like John the Ripper, Hashcat, there's a few other ones. But we'll just end up, basically what we do is we end up copying and pasting these. We'll throw them in the Hashcat and quickly crack it. We'll see password 1, and this is exactly what we're gonna do. So now that we know we have this corp username, we got the password 1, we can start either checking the network to see what rights they have, so we can throw that against a bunch of machines. Do they have admin rights? Can they log into certain machines? Or, you know, what else can I do with this? Or can I use this to get onto other shares, file servers, different things like that. So in a real environment, you're gonna get a ton of these if they don't have this turned off. I mean, you know, I'm actually doing a pen test this week, and I think I gathered like, I don't know, probably like 50 in like, I don't know, less than 10 minutes. So you can just throw those in, and I cracked at least 15 pretty fast, you know, and then just kind of use those and make my way.
And it's a very high impact attack because it does not require any prior access, right? Just simply being on the network allows you to do this attack. If
And it's
doing
not
it remotely and pivoting through another point, you know, so if you compromise, if you get your first jump off point, you do need local admin on the box to be able to inject traffic onto the wire. But if you're actually on the network, like doing an internal pen test, and you have a device on the network that you control, yeah, you don't need any prior access, which is fun.
And I was going to say, just not to interject, but and a big thing about this is it's not a vulnerability. This is something that's how Windows works. So we're not, you know, we're not taking, you know, this isn't something that gets patched or something like that. You're just basically taking advantage of just how something works, which is a big part of what penetration testing is. So it's not always exploit development and this crazy buffer overflow or something like that. Sometimes it's just kind of simple things like this where you're just taking advantage of just
exactly how LLM and R is supposed to be used. We're using it exactly the way it's supposed to be used, just again for our own purposes. You know, the blocks of text, if you remember those orange blocks of text, those were very standard challenge response hashes, basically. The computer attempted to connect to me after it thought I was Sean PC. I said, okay, prove to me you are who you say you are. Here's a nonce, or kind of a string. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's going to hash that and send me back a value. It's going to hash it with its password and send it back. Since I know the thing that came in, I know it went out. The only unknown is what's the password that went in, which allows us to crack it.
We'll do what?
We move to the next one, or more on? All right.
Have me do one more, and then we'll.
So this video, I'll give a little background. This video kind of picks up right where the last one left off. We have that corp user, password 1, creds right now, and here's what we do. No, there it is. All right.
As I watch, will you? This is what we do. What do we do, Doctor?
Yeah.
So right now he's using a tool called WMI exec. So this is an awesome tool that we use a lot. Basically using that, you can use normal users' credentials, as long as they have I shouldn't say normal, an admin user credentials, WMI, and we can easily spawn a shell. So we kind of got that shell back right there.
I was going too quick. I put this one in 1.5x.
Jeez, Dave, come on.
I know, right?
So yeah, so basically you can run standard shell commands. We can do IP config. We can see what's the IP address. We could do like who am I. We could do a bunch of other stuff. But what we're going to do, so we're going to come over to Empire. We're going to take basically our payload, and we're just going to copy and paste it in, and we're going to run it and get our first shell back. So now we have an actual agent, which just allows us just to do a lot more things than just a standard command prompt. It has a lot built-in functionalities. So I think what he's going to do is, first we're going to dump hashes. We're going to use this. We're going to move our mouse a bunch. That's what we're going to do.
Demoing, hey,
yes.
Look at that PowerShell process, and hey, look, we are PC status protected. We're good to go.
Yeah, we are awesome. All right. So we're kind of figure out our agent. You can see kind of information. This tells us that we're basically this user, this Win7 demo, if you can see it. We're going to interact with it. And we're basically going to use a module. So PowerShell, the cool thing about this, PowerShell Empire, is it's kind of like Metasploit, as well as it's got a bunch of built-in modules of just people who've already written a bunch of scripts or different codes you can interact with. It just kind of does your job for you, so you don't have to do it manually. It takes just a lot of repetitive tasks out. So basically what he's doing right now is he's going to look for, okay, we just dumped these hashes, so we're looking, this is what we were kind of looking for, this admin 500. So every Windows machine, the local administrator account is that 500 account. So that's exactly what we want, because what we hope is that they're using the same password on every PC. So we can basically pass that hash. So we don't have to crack it, we don't have to worry about it.
I'm sure you guys that have had some either internship experience or corporate IT experience that have ran into that, where you have a shared admin password between computers or a hard-coded password that's set up during boot. As a pen tester, I love seeing that because it's a very easy backdoor. If you get admin on one box, you basically have admin in all the boxes.
There's a lot of waving. In penetration testing, we wave our mouse a lot. That's what we do.
No, that was the, I could talk over it back when I was doing my first presentation like this. So that was the finance computer, which is our target, because they have calculators and stuff on the finance computer.
Oh, gotcha.
I really want to pop that calc.exe.
That's perfect. All right.
So yeah, that was our target, but we didn't have admin rights there.
So he kind of switched over, so it's kind of neat. So this is Metasploit. This is another framework tool. This has a ton of functionality. It's been around since like 2003. I think it's built in Ruby now. But anyways, he's going to use this pass the hash, just another module. So he's basically going to take that admin hash, as you'll see, and then we're going to use that to spawn another agent, but this time with a little bit higher privileges. And we'll kind of show you what you can kind of do with
Now we're going to be
that.
using that administrator account that we grabbed off our first computer. So our first computer, the corp user had local admin rights on, but our target finance computer, they did not have local admin rights on. So what we did is we grabbed this administrator account off the first computer,
So yeah,
and now we're hoping that it's going to be a shared password.
So we have no idea what it is. We didn't crack it. We don't know what it is. And normally, I mean, for demo purposes, obviously we're just throwing it in. You don't just like throw the hash in and just start making noise. Do not do that. We can talk about that a little bit. This is kind of some basic stuff, just to kind of show you some of the stuff we do. It gets a little bit more advanced when you get into the more secure networks and a lot of different ways we bypass stuff. So some of the stuff won't work in pretty lockdown
So
environments.
it looks like we're setting another payload here. We're going to spawn another Empire shell, hopefully on finance computer now.
And yeah, and then so this one, it kind of shows you, I think he does. Oh, did you do it? There you go.
There it goes.
Yeah, can't see.
So we're running it now, and now we cross our fingers and hope we get it bent. There's our shell.
And when you pen test, this is kind of the coolest thing, is when you get a shell back every time. Never gets old, I don't think so.
There
You're
we
like,
go.
"Ah,
40 stuff.
we're in. And it'll kind of show you, so the difference about this one is that it actually spawned it as a system account.
Yep.
So
Based on what method you're using to get your shell or how you execute your code, you can either be a standard user, an admin user, a system level user, which is kind of the Windows super administrator account, the equivalent to root on Linux. It
So-
looks like here the next thing.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
you can go. Basically, using the system account. The cool thing about the system account is you can actually use that to like dump clear text credentials out of memory. So I don't know if you guys ever heard of Mimikatz. Anybody? You kind of, it's a really popular tool for dumping clear text creds. It actually has a module built in into PowerShell Empire. And Dave ended up using this to basically kind of show you what that kind of looks like.
Go. So back on the calculator computer, and again, PC status protected. Don't worry, guys, you're good to go.
We are golden.
And while our PC status was protected, we were actually able to dump all their passwords in clear text, so that was fun.
Yeah, so basically this kind of will just show you, he's kind of showing you, see the username, you can see basically the hash if you want to just pass a hash, or you'll get the clear text, basically username and password, which then you can use to basically log in normally and stuff like that.
So that's pretty well get on the demos.
Yeah, so I mean, that's pretty much the demo.
As far as
yeah.
resources go,
You can talk about resources. You can do that. All right, what do we got? Puts. Oh, you have the clicker. Yeah, all right, I guess I'll do it. All right. All right, so we have a ton of different resources we can use. So this is, I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff, not even on this slide, that you guys can start doing just to practice, to do whatever you want to do. There's over-the-wire labs. I've never used that one. VulnHub is really cool. It basically lets you download vulnerable machines and basically test these attacks, so you can learn some pretty cool techniques. Some of them you won't necessarily probably see in the real world, but you could. There's some pretty crazy ones. Metasploitable, this is one that Rapid7 puts out, so who creates Metasploit, they come out with a box. I think they're on 3 now, is that the newest one? So 3, so they basically have a box with a bunch of stuff that you can kind of test, certain techniques. Yeah, VM. The DAM vulnerable web app, that's a good one for like web application. There's like RootMe, a really cool one that just came out not too long ago. It's like called, it was hackthebox.eu, I think. And that's supposed to be a really good one, especially if you're doing like your OCP, things like that. And there's basically, I mean, yeah. There's tons of different books. I mean, I guess, is there more?
Oh, no, that's
okay.
Yeah, so over-the-wire labs, though, going back to that, is another cool one. If you guys aren't too familiar with Linux or the command shell, that is a great place to start. It kind of walks you through. They have a series of ever-increasing challenges. I think there's like 25 or 30 in the first one, which is the Bandit Lab. But that really just teaches you about the Linux command line and teaches you a bunch of really useful commands, grep, cut, find, search, all that good stuff. So if you guys are looking to get into that, or hey, how do I use the command line? Great place to start. It takes maybe 4 or 5 hours to get through, but you learn a heck of a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we just kind of, and the reason kind of we were talking about these things is wanted to have this talk. It's like, when Dave and I were in school, we didn't even know this kind of stuff really existed, right? Or let alone that there's even companies in Iowa that you can kind of do this. And it turns out it's kind of a cool job, because you kind of get both of like the creative side. So you spend a lot of your time trying to figure out like, well, how can I bypass this, or how these new techniques come out. But you also get the very technical too as well. So I keep forgetting I got darn clip.
I got the keyboard.
So yeah. Come talk to us. We'd love to hear from you. We're definitely looking for, interns, entry-level positions. We know Iowa State has really smart people, so we definitely want to hear from you guys. We will be at the Engineering Career Fair, February 6th.
So we'll be at the Engineering Career Fair, noon to 5, and then the Business Career Fair. I'll be there from noon to 3. If you come after 3, good luck, And yeah, so come stop by, talk to us, any questions that you have or any follow-ups. And yeah, again, so we are nationwide, so if you want to stay in Des Moines, cool, great. If not, again, we are nationwide, so that's wherever. And then we have one more slide. If you are not yet looking for an internship or job, maybe you're a freshman, sophomore, we do have this cool Technology Consulting Pathways program as well. It's a 2-day program in July of 2018 that is in our Minneapolis location. And that's basically just kind of a day or two in the life, right? So it's a more in-depth version of this rather than an hour. It's like 2 days long. You might get to interact with the client, get some actual hands-on, see us do some real attacks and stuff like that. So that's also a fun one. And that's on Sci-Hire as well.
I guess the only thing I'd add is that there's a lot of other cool things that we didn't get to talk a lot about. We do kind of build tools as well. Custom tools, custom hacking tools. We do a lot of there's a lot more advanced attacks and stuff too that we really couldn't dive into. But it's definitely, I think it's one of the coolest jobs you can have. So definitely like to see it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Very much.
So, what questions do you guys have on kind of subject matter that we covered, subject material we covered? Anything, or?
Just peace out.
All right, cool.
Sir.
That works.
Before we get wrapped up here, Keane's going to do a quick overview.
All right, so I'm going to be doing a quick overview here of Meltdown and Spectre. Who's all heard of Meltdown and Spectre in the news? Probably most of you, all right. So Meltdown and Spectre are some pretty interesting vulnerabilities. Unlike most of the ones we hear about, they're actually in hardware, so they're in the design of the CPU or the actual implementation of the CPUs, which is not something we see too often, but it's pretty exciting when we do. So sorry about all the text here. I just kind of dumped a lot of words there, but I'm not really a CPU architecture guy, so if I say things that are wrong or oversimplified, please correct me. I'll try to do my best explaining otherwise. But first of all, we have Meltdown, which is going to affect your Intel CPUs, so most of your laptops and other devices run Intel CPUs. Some ARM CPUs are also affected. At least since 2010 are the Intel ones, but some may go back to 1995. It's not clear all the affected models yet. But basically the problem here is that any process could read the memory of any other process or any memory in the kernel. So that's a pretty big deal. Any unprivileged user could read memory of any other process. That might have your private keys or passwords or some other secret that you could read from a different process. So that's not good. Spectre is kind of similar, except it affects different processors, Intel, AMD, and ARM. Has a similar consequence where the user process can read memory of other processes, allowing for information compromise. Now this one is, it's kind of understood by researchers, but the entire implications are not fully known, so it might become worse over time, and it will be very hard to fix. So we'll probably hear more about that in the future. And it's not been fully patched yet. Meltdown does have some patches out at this time. And so for both these vulnerabilities, they require local code execution in order to take advantage of them. So this means someone has to be running code on your machine. So it's not going to happen like Heartbleed, where you could attack any server on the internet and dump its memory over the internet. That's not quite how it works. So it's mostly going to affect shared instances where multiple people have access to the server. But there's been proof of concept attacks showing that JavaScript from a website could also run these attacks to gain control of your machine or to read memory on your machine. So, and as I said, they both allow for reading of memory. They don't allow actual, you can't write memory or influence the execution of anything. So to explain Meltdown, some of the background's necessary. The stuff gets a bit in depth with the kernel and stuff, but in general, in modern kernels, when you have a process, it's got its own virtual address space in memory. So when you try to access a memory address, you're not actually referencing an address in RAM physically. You're talking to the kernel, which has a mapping to the actual physical RAM. So it's kind of abstracted away from the process. And if you try to access memory you're not allowed to, the program's going to crash, segmentation fault. So that's kind of done by the kernel to prevent or to help with isolation of processes and to keep things where they should be. And so an interesting part of modern kernels, such as Linux and Windows and others, is that in our address space mapping, we have a bunch of user space memory, and also the entire kernel memory is often mapped as well. Now, the caveat with this is that the process can't just read out of the kernel memory. It's privileged memory, and you have to have the CPU in privileged mode or whatever it's called. So that memory is mapped for the process, but it can't access it at free will. It's restricted, so it's protected for the most part. But you can obviously see that it'd be bad if you were able to read out of the kernel memory from the process. And this is especially because in that physical memory, or in that kernel memory mapping is the entirety of physical memory, at least on Linux. So if you can read from the kernel memory, you can read the entire RAM, basically. And that's very bad. And we'll see how this can be used in Meltdown to actually dump a computer's RAM for the most part. So next slide here. The way Meltdown works is we have two expectations of security in processors and kernels. So the first one is sort of how I mentioned, if you try to access kernel memory from a user process, it's going to raise an exception, a segmentation fault. You can't read that memory because you're not allowed to. And when the processor throws this exception, the pipeline's flushed, all of that state has been incurred there is flushed away, and it's all lost. So that's one thing we're going to break here with Meltdown. The second is the CPU cache is not transparent to processes. We all know it's there, but you can't just say, hey, what's in the cache? What addresses are in the cache? Especially things from other processes. So that's another assumption we kind of have with CPUs and kernels and stuff. But in reality, we can kind of bypass both these assumptions. The first one here is with instructions, the way they're executed. On modern CPUs, I guess the past couple decades, I wouldn't call that entirely modern, but we've had a thing called out-of-order execution, which allows us to take advantage of the processor's pipeline to execute instructions before we complete previous instructions. So you can kind of see, well, I guess there's not the best diagram for that, but in this picture here at the top, we have a raise exception on the first line here. So that would, the process should die there, should be killed by the CPU when the exception's thrown. And we've got a line below it that should never be reached because it's after the exception. However, that's not true because of out-of-order execution. The CPU is going to look ahead and start executing things ahead of time just so it can kind of speed things up. And so in reality, that execution there might actually happen. And so that's what's taken advantage of here. And the second problem is, well, I guess I need to explain this more. So the problem for this comes when we actually we actually try to access a restricted address. So let's say we have a line of code that says, read this kernel memory address and do something with it. Well, that's going to throw an exception because we're not allowed to read kernel memory. But if we have instructions after that one that maybe use that value or do something with it, those still may execute because of this out-of-order execution. And the exception might not be thrown fast enough to completely stop that, so it'll still carry out these instructions before we kill the program and say this exception's been thrown. And so I know that sounds kind of confusing. I'm not doing the best job of explaining it, but it is pretty complicated stuff. So ultimately that allows for us to read a value from the kernel memory, so some secret value, and we can do a few things with it before our execution stops. And so one of the things we do here is use a cache attack from a different part of the process to actually read that data. So we're not able to read this data directly. We have to use a covert channel, which basically means a way of passing data that's not expected between two processes. So there are several attacks against CPU cache that allow us to determine what's in it. And the one we use here in Meltdown is we're going to read the secret value from the kernel memory and then multiply it by some number like 4096, and then we're going to access the memory at that calculated address. And what that does is it's going to populate the CPU cache with that address we hit. And so from another part of our process, we can read the entire cache by accessing different pages. And most of them should return at the same access time. And on this graph here from the paper, most of the addresses return about the same range, 400 to 500 cycles. But you notice there's one standout here under like 200 or so. And that's an address that's been cached. It's already in the cache, so when you try to access it, it's super fast. And so we know that this address has been stored in the CPU cache. And that was something a different process or different part of the process set. So we're able to extract information from that. That value was calculated from our previously stolen secret. So again, this is pretty complicated stuff, and I'm explaining it pretty quickly, and there's lots of text here, so I'm sorry if you don't understand the intricacies of this, but any questions on that so far? I know I talked a bit fast. All right, going on to mitigations. So even if that was a bit complicated, there's still ways to protect yourself against this one. Meltdown is pretty well taken care of. There are patches already out in the wild for most major operating systems and distributions. The most common one is called KPTI, or formerly Kaiser, which is for Linux. And it pretty much, I mentioned earlier how each process's virtual address space has the kernel memory mapped in it. This patch pretty much removes the kernel memory mapping from the process address table. And so there's only a few addresses left over for essential functions, but you can no longer access kernel memory at all from the processes. And that's the fix currently for that. It's kind of a band-aid fix since the problem itself actually lies in the hardware, but it's pretty sufficient for now. Additionally, another fix for this would be to disable out-of-order execution. However, on modern CPUs, that would pretty much destroy the performance that we expect from them, so that's not really doable. Lastly, we'll probably see CPUs and kernels that are designed with this in mind and have a very distinct separation of kernel and user memory so that you can't even do this sort of thing, and hopefully fixes for those caching attacks as well. Spectre is a bit more complicated. I don't fully understand this one as well, but it's similar to Meltdown. If you've taken CPRE 381, you might have talked about branch prediction, where the CPU will try to predict when there's a branch, it'll try to predict which outcome is going to be taken next based on often statistical behavior of that program. And so how this works is the attacker can usually trick the CPU into taking a certain branch that it expects. In this example here, we have a conditional. Let's say this is a branch here. We've got a conditional that checks array bounds. If you access in this array, if you were to access a value that's greater than the size of the array, you'd be accessing memory you're not allowed to access. And this conditional, if x is greater than the array size, it'll fail. But what we can do is we can convince the CPU that this branch should be taken and this code should be executed. And similar to in Meltdown, it'll execute those instructions even if we don't take that branch. So let's say x is actually bigger than the array size, and this branch is not taken, but the CPU thinks it's going to be taken. It'll execute this stuff ahead of time. Even though x is greater than the array size, it'll still execute it, and we'll get this value saved that we can use in the same way as Meltdown. We can use a side channel in the cache to try to exfiltrate that value and read memory we're not supposed to have access to. So it's a bit different in that this one kind of attacks the branch taking and branch prediction. This one's useful when the code is running in something like a sandbox where you can't access all the memory and you want to learn more about that sandbox or the interpreter or something like that. And so it has some fixes that are in the works, some patches for, that's a patch for Linux there, and that kind of changes the way branches are predicted. But it's not really a complete fix. Again, it's sort of a Band-Aid fix, and we're still learning about all the implications of this vulnerability, and the fixes are still going to be a long ways out. So further reading on these topics, there's a website for Meltdown and Spectre. It's meltdownattack.com or spectreattack.com, and both of the papers are linked there. If you're interested, I suggest reading through the papers. They are a bit complicated, but fairly interesting as well. So any questions on that stuff at all? No CPU designers in here at all? All right. All right, well, thank you.
Okay, so that's everything we have for this week. Like I said before, if you're not on our mailing list, you should definitely get on it if you want to receive information on what's going to be for next week's week. I typically send those out Monday or Sunday. And yeah, so we'll be in here next Tuesday at 5:15. Thanks for coming out, everyone.